The history and legacy of any competitively relevant deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Follows a sort of Hegelian dialectical method. And while Hegel was, by all accounts, a bigger fraud than the sea monster of Theseus, there is a form of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that follows any new competitive deck. The deck introduces itself into the game, often with a bang. There's significant hype and speculation that follows, and, over the course of a few tournaments, the deck establishes itself as a cornerstone of the format, the thesis. Eventually, this deck wears out its welcome, drawing cries of over-centralization and power creep gone awry. A ban list does what it must do, and the deck is stricken from the competitive record, the antithesis. Over time, and as the game develops further, players develop a nostalgic fondness for the days of the deck's relevance, often in response to some new bugbear dominating the format. And the old deck is slowly freed from the chains of the ban list, often to the fanfare of the player base and with little competitive impact, the synthesis. This is the life cycle of relevant competitive strategies. Active in our consciousness for a long time, they stick around long after the deck has left the forefront of competitive play and make up a part of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Mythos. Think of decks like Nekroz, Teledad, Dragon Ruler, Orchist, significant portions of Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history intertwined with the decks that represent them. What happens then when the best deck in the format just fades, suddenly steps out of the competitive limelight, and seems to go unremembered by the community? This was the fate of Swordsoul, a deck that fought it out for the title of best deck in format, only to vanish without a trace. First, a brief recap of the strategy. Swordsoul is an archetype of worms with a heavy focus on synchro summoning that debuted in the set Dawn of Majesty, which released to the TCG in August of 2021. With a second wave of support in Burst of Destiny in November of that same year, the stage for dominance was set. The archetype centered around a host of main deck monsters who all had differing effects that summoned a tuner token monster, and locked you into synchro summoning while that token was on the field. This enabled a host of synchro plays, from the deck's powerful in-archetype options like Qishao, a searcher with a negate, and Chenying, a tough-to-bring-down Bungus who could banish your opponent's cards, to generic options like Draco Berserker of the Tenyi and the Tier 0 meta threat Crimson Blader. The deck was powerful, consistent, and incredibly boring. Normal Summon Moye unseated Normal Summon Alistair as the tagline for the smallest-brained Yu-Gi-Oh! Players at your locals, but its place in the meta was undeniable. Over time, the deck solidified in its use of the Tenyi engine, a collection of worms that benefit from having non-effect monsters on the field. The Tenyis gave Swordsoul greater flexibility in playing around hand traps, increased the total number of worms in deck for activating the token-generating effects of your Swordsoul monsters, and provided the deck with board breaking, extension, and recovery while controlling a non-effect monster, which the tokens that the main deck monsters generated just so happened to be. The deck was an immediate hit, topping events left and right, and establishing itself as a mainstay in the format. And while it shared much of its limelight with equally powerful decks like Tri-Brigade, Drytron, and later in its life in the meta, Branded, Swordsoul had so much going for it that it seemed that the deck would be relevant forever, until the day that it dropped off a cliff. Near the end of Swordsoul's reign, the format was pretty universally considered to be open and low-powered, with many different strategies vying for a place in the meta. This changed on August 5th, 2022, with the release of the TCG set Power of the Elements. And with this set, the gates of hell were opened. Tearlaments and Sprite, two of the most powerful archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, entered the format and wiped away all traces of the game that came before. There was nothing before. There was only Pote format, and that's all there would ever be. Pote took the previously balanced and equal power level of the preceding months and threw it out the window, replacing it with what began as a 2-deck format that eventually narrowed to a 1-deck Tier 0 nightmare after the release of the set Magnificent Mavens and the introduction of these Shizu cards into the game. If there's one thing that Yu-Gi-Oh! Players love, it's gambling. The new decks released in Power of the Elements brought to the table significantly higher ceilings than a deck like Swordsoul. Swordsoul, as previously mentioned, is incredibly consistent, allowing for the same level 8 and 10 synchro plays every turn. And while this made it exceptionally good for a longer tournament where consistency is king, it was also very balanced, and the end boards simply couldn't compete with the explosive and durable boards put out by Tier and Sprite. In the competition between high floor and high ceiling, time and time again it's demonstrated that high ceiling decks will win out in player popularity, even if those decks have the potential to draw unplayable starting hands or to get bogged down waiting for a starter. To put in perspective the immense format warping impact of Power of the Elements, YCS Hartford took place on May 28, 2022, and demonstrated both the format's low power ceiling and wide open competitive landscape. 11 different decks occupied the top 32, everything from Drytron to Flu. Swordsoul was the most represented deck at 7 showings in the top 32, but Sky Striker took home the entire YCS. Now, the very next YCS, which took place on August 27th in Rio de Janeiro, not even 3 months after YCS Hartford and the first YCS with Power of the Elements legal, had a combined 19 Sprite and TR-Limit players in the top 32. Although the total number of represented decks stayed the same at 11, the number of pilots tanked. By YCS Niagara, barely 2 weeks later, Tier and Sprite occupied 27 of the top 32 spots. This culminated in YCS Pasadena in November of 2022, where Tier alone took 26 of the top 32 spots. Swordsoul disappeared from existence the moment Pote released. While it was still a no-joke deck that could be played at locals or small regionals, heck, I played it, the deck was simply unable to be considered for major tournaments, due in no small part to the second explanation I'd like to talk about. Swordsoul is just too fair. Think of the words that I and many have used to describe the deck so far: consistent, balanced, boring, fair. Oftentimes, a top meta contender has to do something broken in order to twist your opponent's arm into defeat. In a way, the entire purpose of archetypes is to enable cards to do unfair things, with the specificity of archetype requirements hemming in the flexibility while raising the power ceiling. Swordsoul checked all of the boxes of a meta legend. Searching in the form of Emergence and Qishao, board breaking in Vashutta, Draco Berserker, and others, one-card starters, the ability to both play an enormous amount of hand traps, for the time anyway, and itself play around hand traps. It had it all. Eventually, the deck even had access to a generic Omni-Negate and destruction in the form of Barone. What the deck lacked, however, was a way to break the game. Despite the flexibility added by the Tenyis, you were still required to open very specific hands in order to get your turn going. These hands became even more specific if you were going to play around the aforementioned hand traps. The way that I've described it in the past is that Swordsoul is always capable of producing some end board, even if it's a blackout pass with a few hand traps and grip. But if you don't open ideally, your end board was simply not enough to survive passing turn. Going second, Incredible Ecclesia was an incredible answer to interrupting baiting out negates before committing to the normal summon. But these were all plays that could be skillfully responded to by knowing opponents, and didn't leverage into winning positions on their own. While the deck certainly could finesse an end board around multiple negates, very often imperming the normal summon was simply enough. People will lie to you and say that the deck had lines to play around Nibiru as well, but let me tell you, leading with Longwan discarding to start with Barone meant that the remainder of your hand had to be absolutely flawless in order to continue playing. It was always cope. The closest that Swordsoul has ever inched to unfair was its access to the powerhouse Arch Nemesis Protoss, a worm that was searchable off Swordsoul Emergence, which was searchable off Qishao, which was usually your first synchro summon of the turn. This beast could be special summoned by banishing 3 monsters with different attributes from your grave or face-up field. This was easily achievable in Swordsoul, as every single main deck monster had a different attribute. This card could, as a quick effect, pop a card to destroy all monsters that shared the attribute of the popped card, and would lock both players out of special summoning that attribute monster. By targeting itself, Protoss could lock your opponent out of darks, and since it was immune to destruction by card effect, you wouldn't even lose your monster. Protoss was eventually banned and later freed on the Forbidden and Limited list. This was the only ban list hit ever targeted towards Swordsoul in the TCG. No, Barone doesn't count. It was never Barone. When I say that Protoss was the only Swordsoul adjacent card to ever hit the banned list, does that strike you as odd? Most of the time, the decks that are the biggest shakers in the game's competitive history lay slain on the battlefield of the only foe they couldn't defeat, the Forbidden and Limited list. Zodiac Trident, banned. Kashtira Riseheart, banned. Half the Tier Elements archetype, the entire Dragon Ruler archetype. Colossus and Mirage Stalio, Gumblar Dragon. The ban list is as much a historical record of all of the best decks of all time as it is a method to balance out the game and make way for new product. When a deck is pushed out of the format without having key in archetype cards banned, it becomes easy to forget. We're no longer reminded of its existence every few months when the list comes out. In a way, all of these points come together into a single sentence. Swordsoul was forgotten because it was too fair, and was thus pushed out of the meta by Pote without the need for a ban list. Swordsoul support has been weird since its moment of meta dominance. Cards like the Abyss Dragon Swordsoul and Swordsoul Punishment are strangely weaker than cards released 2 years earlier, and don't really follow the established themes set by the deck in its infancy. While the Tenyis have received recent, interesting support, it doesn't play nicely with Swordsoul, requiring convoluted lines involving field spells or very specific hands that somehow have both too much and not enough to see play. If Swordsoul doesn't already have a legacy, I'd like to wrap this short video up by giving it one. Swordsoul is quite possibly the best deck in the game to introduce to new players. The combo lines are easy to understand and are rewarding. The wide range of extra deck plays reward creative deck building, but the in-archetype options are strong enough that players can feel safe keeping it close to home. The deck has been incredibly inexpensive post-Mavens and can be adjusted to grow with the skill ceiling of the new player until they're ready to try something else. This may not be the most impressive legacy for what was once a proud meta deck, but it's something worth respecting and a far greater title than the meta deck that time forgot. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please check out some of the others on my channel. I'm just getting back into content creation, so join me for the wild ride of what this channel will become. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and remember to wash behind your ears.